if we have no shared truth, we have no shared values. It's hyper-individualism down to the individual. There's no reason to pay your taxes, Ben, because your taxes are going to somebody else who isn't you.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My conversation this week is with a friend of mine, Jaret Hargreaves, in Calgary, and we're talking about the novel 1984 by George Orwell. This book was written in 1949, and just 6 months later, George Orwell died. It's an important book not just because of what it says about that time, but what it says about today. Orwell is widely known as a prescient author, not just from 1984, but his book Animal Farm, his many articles and essays, and his work as a newspaper journalist back in the 1920s and 30s. A really interesting man and a really interesting author who saw a lot of things that were coming. And Jaret and I do talk about some of these things. Now, I should note that this conversation, first of all, provides some spoilers about the book. And of course, this is not a book review. This is a conversation springing from the book. A conversation that treats Orwell and the book 1984 as the expert. Now, here are some of the things that we talk about. Totalitarianism, the telescreen and the mobile phone, the 3 acts of the book, the power of corporations and the question of whether or not they are inhabiting the same space of the state that Orwell prescribes in the book. Knowledge versus ignorance, that old question that we deal with many times on this podcast. Deep fake videos, the fluidity and modularity of modern digital life. Language, the purpose of conflict in the media. The old media, which is a shared narrative, and the new media, which is a fractured one. Anarchism, the constant reference in the book to dying and death, this concept of doublethink, and the debate between nature and nurture. Now, there's a lot more in between these lines in this conversation and, of course, in this book, and I highly recommend that you pick it up and read it. I think it has a lot to say about our life and the world today. It certainly answers the question, what on earth is going on? Now, just a reminder, if you like this show, please go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca, sign up to the newsletter, give us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast provider that you use, and make sure you get in touch with me to send me your suggestions for future guests and future topics to be discussed on this program. I would really love to hear from you either by email or on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, whatever you want. Send me a note. Let me know what you think. And again, the website is whatonearthisgoingon.ca. Jaret Hargreaves, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Ben.
I'm so thrilled to have you here.
I'm glad to have you here.
Even though we're here at your apartment.
Welcome back to Calgary.
Thank you very much. I love your view of downtown Calgary, and I think I'm going to be in the coming conversation looking at the buildings and thinking about George Orwell's 1984, which is the book that we're talking about, in reference to the crazy society that we live in, which is so remarkably different from anything that he may have been able to imagine, even though he did imagine some facets of it.
Pretty impressive given when he wrote the book. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, which was in the late 1940s.
47, 48, and then it was published in 49.
Yep. And I actually read this morning that the earliest idea for him came in around 1944 when he talked about in a letter, he talked about his fear of the horror of emotional nationalism, and also the idea of subjecting or subverting objective reality to the whims of totalitarian dictators,
right,
who make a statement and it has to be true.
Sure, and it's not all that surprising, I guess, then that the ideas for the book were being planted in the war, and then immediately after the war he sat down and penned the thing. Yeah.
Right. Yep. So obviously this is a conversation between you and I about this book, 1984. Neither of us are an expert in the book. We both read it. We've both obviously taken notes about it.
Yep.
This is my second time reading, and I think it's your second time too.
Yeah, it's been ages though.
Right. But neither of us are an expert. We're treating George Orwell as the expert in this conversation.
Yes.
So I've been really excited to talk about this book. It was on my list of the books that I wanted to talk to people about for this podcast, but I thought no one was going to pick it. I thought it was just going to, languor there on the list forever, and I'm like, I'm never going to get a chance. And then, of course, one of the first people that I asked, Jaret, you come along and say, I want to do 1984. I'm like, yes!
Well, it's not a light read, right?
It's not a light read, but it is relatively short.
Yes.
It didn't take me too long to get through.
No, and once you get reading it, you do just want to devour the rest of it.
Right.
Yep.
And the only other thing I wanted to say about this conversation is that it's not a book review. It's a conversation springing from the book. So we might spend the next 40 minutes talking about, well, downtown Calgary and how it relates to George Orwell's 1984, or we might talk about the book itself, but it's not a review of the book.
I think it's been well reviewed at this point, yeah.
I think so. Yeah. Even recently, actually. The article that I was reading that was talking about the provenance of the book was from 2017.
Sure.
After Kellyanne Conway, Donald Trump's counselor, said that there are alternative facts with the inauguration crowds that obviously the Trump White House was saying were the biggest ever, and everyone knew was demonstrably false.
Yep.
But that statement rocketed this book back to the #1 spot on the New York Times bestseller list because people were saying that language of quote-unquote alternative facts harkens right back to George Orwell and what he was trying to say in this book. So, Jared, I want to get right to the question. According to this book, what on earth is going on?
Right. So I look at it in the frame of when George Orwell wrote it. It was immediately after the Second World War. So obviously the whole world is healing at that point. And according to him, there was the danger of totalitarianism. There was the danger that various forces would take over and what that might mean for the average working person.
So what is totalitarianism?
So it is total control by the state over the affairs. And so I think at that time the point of reference is Soviet Russia, where they're looking at central planned economies and that sort of thing. Total and we'll get into it, I'm sure, but the idea of thought control is sort of the ultimate control. Yeah,
one thing that's interesting about totalitarianism is it becomes not just control over the economy or the military or culture, but control over the individual.
Yep.
And Orwell's prescient thought in the 1940s was that the telescreen, this device that not only sends you information but receives information from you, kind of like a mobile phone today or a smartphone, would not only end privacy but allow government to be truly totalitarian. And there's some writing in the book actually from O'Brien, the character, who says that the old despotisms were about thou shalt not. Totalitarians are thou shalt, but the new order of Oceania is thou art.
Yeah, and I think the telescreen, for me, the book sort of breaks down into 3 acts, and the first act is sort of establishing the place, and a lot of it is about establishing the mood and what technologies exist and what Winston Smith's life is like, what the protagonist's life is like day to day. And the telescreen is probably the first example of something that was a pretty forward-looking concept for an author in 1949, right? So, yeah, the telescreen, the idea, like you say, of a television that watches you as you watch it.
And they're everywhere.
They're in your condo.
They're in your condo.
There's a tiny little nook in your condo where you can sit and it can't see you, but of course it's still listening to you.
Right. And of course, I mean, spoiler here, but Winston Smith, the main character, thinks that he can't be seen.
That's right.
But of course he can. He's been watched the whole time.
Yeah.
That there is nowhere you can go. There's even writing in the book where he goes out into the farmland, into rural country, and thinking there might be microphones in the bushes.
That's right.
Listening to him at any time. And of course, Orwell couldn't have predicted artificial intelligence or just the power of big data today.
Yep.
But he essentially said, you don't know if someone's watching and listening to you at any time or not. So you might as well assume that they are.
And I think by writing the protagonist to someone who's working in one of the ministries and working in the records department, it establishes right away that tons and tons of people work for the government. And so it is conceivable to the character that there is always someone listening, because there may be as many people listening as doing in this world.
Right. So I want to also talk about, the telescreen is, to me, the most obvious reference point between 1984 and today. It's something we can all relate to. We're being watched. There's speakers now in our homes that are listening to everything that we say, recording everything that we do.
Yep.
I don't know if I say Alexa right now, will it wake up?
No. So no Alexa, no Google Home. I work for a technology company, but the idea of having those speakers in the house constantly listening to you and, ordering Kleenex for you because you're watching a sad movie is a little bit weird to me still.
I find that really interesting. This is a bit of a tangent, but that technology people like you who work in startups or the tech sector are not technophobic, obviously, but they know the dangers of this stuff because they see it every day and they don't want it in their own homes. I'm looking around, I see books, I see games, I see a very tactile life.
Yeah, and my day job is digital. full digital, and so a lot of my evenings and weekends are analog, a lot of board games and that sort of thing. And I think you're right. I think that the people who work with technology are the ones best equipped to understand the dangers of it.
Well, they're the ones often waving the flag and saying, this is a problem.
That's right. Yeah, they're the ones figuring out that Alexa is listening into all your conversations.
Right, and saying that Facebook, for example, is actually addictive and dangerous, almost like smoking.
That's right. Yeah, and I see a cultural inflection point right now where people are worried about, in a way that they haven't been previously, to the Facebooks and the Amazons and just the sheer amount of information people have about you.
Right. And that's another feature of 1984, is that the government knows the government. They don't even call it the government.
Yep.
The state, this
Big brother.
all-encompassing big brother power
Yep.
knows everything about you, in fact, more than you know yourself. And that becomes apparent towards the end of the book, that O'Brien, who is actually the antagonist of the book, even though at the beginning he's set up as a potential ally, knows Winston Smith before Winston Smith knows himself. He knows what he's going to do. He knows what he's thinking.
Yep.
It's like mind control and mind reading.
Yeah, and when the technology started to advance here, 5 or 10 years ago, where you bought a couple of things on Amazon, and all of a sudden it predicted the next thing you wanted to buy, you thought, that's fantastic. There's utility to that for me. Of course, the utility to them is gathering that information and being able to predict those things.
Are we being alarmist when we talk about Amazon? I mean, obviously government is a big fear, right? And that security services, whether it's CSIS in Canada or the NSA or CIA in the United States spying on its own citizens. But when we talk about corporations using data to sell you things, are we being alarmist about that? Or is there a way in which that could really transmogrify into a totalitarian state?
So there are certainly arguments to be made right now that the large corporations have more power than small countries, right? You're looking at now 3 companies that have been worth over $1 trillion. And so, yeah, they have the reach and the power to do things that traditional corporations didn't used to do. And so in the book, where you see the sort of 3 world states that split power across the world, you could very easily see that as corporate states that are taking over the world. And they're not geographically constrained, but how many people are on Facebook? How many people shop on Amazon? And so I think the question in the book, or in that case, comes back to, is the power benevolent? So it's all well and good to say that they have a ton of information about you, but is what they're doing with your information benevolent? And in both cases, do you have any power over what information they're collecting, what they can do with it? There have been some interesting ideas coming out of the States. I think there's a senator down there who's been saying you should be told exactly what the information that has been collected by Amazon or Google is worth to them, so that you know the secret tax. You're not paying $0 to have a Gmail account. There is some value to the company for that. And so should you have a right to understand how much that is worth?
Well, and furthermore, should you have a right to be paid for your data? I mean, what do you think of that idea?
Or to opt out, to say, if they're making $10 a month off of me, should I have the opportunity instead to choose to pay $10 a month for that service and say that they can't collect my information? So, GDPR in Europe, there's a GDPR Lite in California that they're working on, that sort of thing. And I think people are waking up to it, but I'm also worried that those same tech companies can get ahead of the curve. They can know where we're going, and you can see that now, especially in the United States, where they're starting to craft the policy. They're starting to put the proposals forward themselves.
What's an example of that?
I'm not sure. It's all in the very early stages down there, but they're putting together their plans because they can see that the policies are coming in the next couple of years. And so instead they're lobbying and that sort of thing. I don't have specific examples.
Like, would an example be potentially that Facebook knows that people might try to break it up? Right?
Yep.
And so therefore they're going to not only prepare for that eventuality, but try to prevent it and use all the power of a nearly $1 trillion company to prevent that. And if that's how powerful you are, there's really nothing you can do. I mean, we all know in this society that if a company gets sued, they will hire such good lawyers that you really can't win.
Sure. Or if there are, say, someone out there has some draft legislation, says there's 20 things they want to change, the company can look at those and say, which one of these are we willing to accept and which ones are we going to dig in really hard on? Which are we going to lobby hard on because they have real value to us? Right.
And in the book, one thing that references this is, again, O'Brien, who says that the power that we wield is not about good or bad or evil or improving humanity. It's power for the sake of power. And that sounds more like a modern corporation than it does like a modern government.
Sure, it's a pure motivation.
Right, because it's the pure motivation like a profit line, right? Like I'm just seeking more money. It's very simple. It's very pure. We know what a company's doing. They're not lying to us. I know that when a company sells me a product, they're getting a benefit from doing that. They're not being, altruistic in selling me something, and a company's not being altruistic in giving me a service.
Yeah, it's a single metric, right? They're going to say this year it's the valuation of the company or it's the profit that we make or whatever. And as you see in that third act when O'Brien starts to reveal everything, he's sort of, in a way, he's explaining it to Winston, but he's also explaining it to the reader. Here are all the things that you've been wondering about. Here are all the things maybe this will work. And so O'Brien is slowly unraveling your thoughts and your arguments against how things might work out.
That's kind of how it felt sometimes in reading this book. Like they knew what I might be thinking about the situation. Mm-hmm. And, Winston Smith is me in the book. Obviously, I am the reader and he's my protagonist. And O'Brien is the person saying, I know what you're thinking. Yeah. I know you're going to look for a solution out of this. And there is no one solution out of this because you're screwed. And Winston's constant thought that the proles, the proletariat, the working class, the 85% of the population who are disenfranchised and uninformed, who read newspapers full of, I think it was crime, sports, and astrology.
The lottery.
And the lottery.
Is a big thing that never gets awarded. No one ever actually wins the lottery, but everybody's always playing the lottery and talking about the lottery and their systems. They have systems to try to play the lottery.
Which is so interesting because the lottery today is kind of like that. It's so rare to win. You might as well not have a winner.
That's right.
But it keeps people motivated. It keeps people watching. It's so exciting when you see a photograph of someone holding that check because their life changed, and the story of that is so powerful for the listener or the watcher. And anyways, you have this society of the disinformed and the disenfranchised that Winston thinks will be his salvation, and O'Brien very clearly says, no, not a chance. They never have, and they never will. But you get a sense in it that Orwell thinks that maybe that may be the only way out.
I think so, and I think he's arguing that, and you see that Winston at the end is broken. But that doesn't mean that he's wrong. That doesn't mean that the earlier inclinations he has is wrong. And I think that's the ray of hope that Orwell leaves in. And when you look at it, I think they said something like 85% of people are proles. And in a way, it sort of dawns upon Winston, but only right before everything goes to pot, that the proles, in some ways, are better off than he is as a member of the outer party. Because they don't have a telescreen in every room. This is when he finds that room. It turns out to be a trap, but when he finds that room, he doesn't think there's a telescreen there, and he can sit there in bliss and read a book.
And also bring his lover, Julia.
Spend time with Julia, in the room. So, and he starts to imagine what it might be like, and it doesn't go far down the road, but you can imagine him. He says once or twice, let's just escape. Let's just become proles, go hide somewhere. Get off the grid, right?
But isn't this the classic philosophical question of knowledge versus ignorance? To know, which Winston chooses, he wants to know. He wants to read Goldstein's book. Mm-hmm. He wants to know what this is about. He wants to preserve that inner part of him that knows that 2 + 2 = 4. And he doesn't want to certainly he wants to give it up, but that he will never give it up. You know that there's a core in him that maybe Orwell talked about, that core of humanity that is curious and that seeks out deceit and tries to find the truth.
Yeah, and this is something where I think he was prescient to today, where you say, well, 85% of people, what would we say today as modern intellectuals? 85% of people today are watching the Kardashians, they're watching reality TV, they're scrolling, they're swiping through Facebook. That's all that they do. That's their lottery. Those are their trivialities, and they don't really know what's going on. And this is something that I thought, something where I think he did get it wrong, in a sense, at least for how we see things in the modern day. And that is where the idea of censorship, the idea of taking information away from people, of being highly structured and presenting something. Instead, today, we get too much information. We get so much information all the time through all our various streams that we can't separate fact from fiction. It isn't the case that there is a controlling body somewhere who's crafting the narrative in a really well-orchestrated way and making sure to replace old messages. We can't keep the old messages in our head because it's just being blown out by the new information we're assimilating all the time.
Yeah, it's the post-truth era, right? Yep. Where there's just so much, but there's also disagreement on basic facts. Mm-hmm. Alternative facts or the basic facts or simply the people who believe that the earth is flat. and they are entitled to their opinions, as we always say. That's the structure of our society that we've created, and also the danger of the society that we've created. We've allowed for idiocy to exist.
Yep.
But as Voltaire said, I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it.
Yep.
But maybe that is being short-circuited in our society today by having so much information and so many mediums to present that information. I can access not only the same news article, but the same piece of news through countless outlets that have a different bent in each one. Some will deny it, some will reject it, some will go around it completely.
Sure. And so when you see the president getting up and giving what in normal times would have been a 4 or 5 minute speech, and everybody would have seen the whole 4 or 5 minutes, and we would have all at least been presented the same information, he gets up and he talks for hours and hours. And so any news outlet knows, Ben, what you want to see on your evening news because you're sitting down to watch MSNBC. And any news outlet, is whether it's Fox News or MSNBC or whoever else, is going to be able to pull whatever quote they want out of those hours and hours of rambling and reinforce with everybody what they already think. Go and reinforce all of your biases.
Or going forward, they may be able to simply invent that quote and make it look real, make it sound real, right?
Yeah, some of those videos in the last year or two where they have taken Obama and on video made him say things that he never said. And be able to simulate his voice and his mannerisms and everything. Those are scary.
I've heard that called Orwellian before.
Sure.
And is that because simply Orwell talked about people, Winston Smith being one of them, who could manipulate the past and make it into something new? Is that why we call it Orwellian?
I think so. And so Orwell, at the time that he was in, Joseph Stalin was this example of a totalitarian who was casually airbrushing people out of photographs. So we're not all that far. Yes, we're more technologically advanced. Yes, we can do audio and video now, but people have been airbrushed out of photos for a long time. So I think that's where the idea of Orwellian comes from, is he was observing his time, and it's still relevant today.
I remember reading this book back maybe 10, 12 years ago, and there was one thought that I had, which was the power of a written book, the power of a piece of paper, whether it's a newspaper or a book that I have in front of me, and that it can't be changed. Or if it's going to be changed, it would be really hard to do. You'd have to sneak into my room in the middle of the night. You'd have to take it away. You'd have to replace
every copy.
it. And like Winston says, you'd have to put the speck of dust that I knew that was there yesterday on it so that I know that it hasn't been tampered with.
Yep.
Too much work, not going to happen. On my phone, I can look up, again, a New York Times article, review about 1984 by George Orwell, and that may have been changed hundreds of thousands of times since when it was written 2 years ago.
And it may have been tailored just for you. It may have been edited in ways that are just for you.
Right. And if I take a screenshot of it, that screenshot may be tampered with. There's really nothing I can do. There's the objective reality becomes so fluid. My view of the world becomes so modular and modifiable that I may as well just give up and accept whatever's being told to me at any given point, knowing that, it's probably changed.
Yeah, and that's where we're getting used to these ideas in social media and stuff. The gotcha moments are when somebody posts something ridiculous, and they don't think at the time they're posting something ridiculous, and people are taking screen caps before they can tear that message down, before someone on the communications team says, hey, that was a really boneheaded idea, let's pull that down. Somebody's taking a screenshot, but you're right. What's to say that screenshot is authentic?
Right, and it's easy to do.
Yes.
Manipulating a New York Times article, it's not only easy to do, it's done.
Yes.
I mean, it would, if there's a spelling mistake, they're going to edit that and not tell me that there was a spelling mistake originally. They wouldn't do that.
That's right.
But it just means that they have the power to do so. And I guess my question is, is it important for people to have physical books? Or is that the kind of time we're living in? Is that the danger we may be facing? Or am I being alarmist again?
I think it makes sense to have it on your mind as a frame, and that's why I like reading all the dystopian novels, is this idea of the worst possible place. And so by keeping that in mind, it's a way to not let that future become the case. Of course, 1984 is in the past now, but it's challenging to imagine all of these worlds and not get swept up in all that negativity.
Another aspect of this book that I really want to dig into is language. Obviously, this is probably Orwell's biggest fascination, is the idea of evolving language and the effect of language, the utility of language, but also how language can be manipulated. And one of the key thoughts in this book is that this state of Oceania wants to make thought crime illegal. Not thought crime illegal, thought crime impossible to think, so that Orwell's contention would be that all thought is based in language. You think in language, you think in words. That is how the modern human being thinks, or at least philosophers have said that for some time now. So if you don't have the language to construct an illegal thought, then you will not have an illegal thought. Thought crime will be literally impossible. I'm reading that and I'm thinking that makes sense from a philosophical point of view, but I don't know if that's true, or I don't know if that's true anymore if we think in language in the way that Orwell seems to premise this.
Sure. So in the book where there are the three large federations that are in effect, maybe ironically, given today's, it's the United States, Russia, Soviet Russia, and China. So they're the three superpowers. And so if you could say that in each of those three countries there were just three languages, and they are, for all intents and purposes, completely self-contained, then the idea that you might be able to control the language everywhere is conceivable.
Right.
But I think we find language is a virus, right? Language mutates so quickly. And I find myself even, I'm not a cranky old man yet, but I find that I correct people's grammar and that sort of thing in a way that my grandparents used to when I was young. But language evolves. So the idea that writing a dictionary and saying that would manage the way that people would speak, I think is a little bit naive.
But what if you enforced it like they enforced it in 1984?
Sure. I mean, you would need telescreens in all 100% of the homes.
It's almost essentially they do, or they will soon get there. You get an impression in 1984 that they're leading to a place that will have absolute control of the state.
There is a bit of a contradiction, though, there, and it's sort of in Act 2, Winston starts to think about these contradictions as he's reading the book around technology. It's not going anywhere. So the place that the party wants it to be is in stasis. So at some point, technology is not going to be getting any better. We take for granted now that computers get smaller, computers get cheaper. Alexa, inconceivable 10 years before, is in your home. But in this world, if things are really in stasis, there aren't the resources to do that, to miniaturize things and hide things in all of the homes. I can see it, yeah, and it might not actually be important whether there's a working telescreen in every home, so long as there's a telescreen in every home, as long as there's the fear that that's the case.
And this goes back to actually your earlier point about how there's too much as opposed to too little. Mm-hmm. The journey of language in this book is diminishing. The Newspeak 11th edition of the dictionary, I think, is going to have fewer words than the English language has ever had.
Right.
And it's going to reduce the language to the bare function of it. And then it's going to continue to cut out words and cut out ideas until there's almost nothing left.
So no synonyms, no antonyms, right? That if good is good enough to explain excellent and bad, then you can just use good. Why would you have excellent and
double
bad?
Good, double plus good.
That's right.
And you can also have the definition of bad contained within good, so ungood, as opposed to good and bad. And this whole idea is really interesting, but it seems that maybe we're living in a world with an increasingly infinite number of selections of words, right?
So we see, I'm not sure about that, we see a world where more and more the number of people that are speaking English is growing. So English itself becomes more complex. It's a language that tends to adopt words from other languages and use it as their own. But we also see the extinction of many languages. And so it's the Tower of Babel, but many, many centuries after it was first written, the idea of the number of languages diminishing, and eventually that there might be one language. And it would probably be, if you watch Firefly, if you watch any of Joss Whedon's stuff, the idea is that 500 years in the future, everybody pretty much speaks a mashup of English and Chinese.
Yeah. And does that lend itself to Orwell's ideas and vision for the future, or is this something that might actually protect us from it, if it's coming?
Well, if there's one language, it's easier to control one language. So I think that would, yeah.
But can you but going back to the point, can you control language in the way that Orwell's talking about, or is it, as you say, a virus that will always frustrate control?
This is one of the things where I tried to imagine a world order with 3 regions, and the idea that at no point would they have any interest in competing with one another. So if in 2 of those regions the plan was the same, and they make the case in the book that all 3 are the same. They all want stasis. They're slightly different forms with different labels, but it's all the same thing. But if 2 of those regions were in stasis, and the third was still putting money into research and still developing more powerful weapons, if the goal of the thing, and this is what O'Brien says, the goal of the thing is power, why wouldn't they want utter domination of the world? And the only way to do that is for your power to be greater than the other 2.
Right. And this whole geopolitical situation of the 3 powers, Oceania, East Asia, and Eurasia, is interesting to me, but it's also probably the most fantastic of Orwell's ideas in the book. It's the most how would you put this? It's the most unearned part of the book. Like it's just this idea that he puts out there that makes the world possible, but it's probably never going to happen that way.
It creates a sandbox in which the book can take place, though.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, thank you. I was struggling there to try to put my point on it. But so I guess I just wonder, how important is it, this idea that these 3 powers are constantly at war? I mean, I understand this idea in the book for Winston and for any inner party, outer party, or prole in the book that knows that we're always at war. We always have to make sacrifices. It is endless. But one day, if we don't make sacrifices, they're going to come and kill us all. I know that that's important. But geopolitically, is it important, or is it just, again, the sandbox that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think it's part of the world building. I think Julia is a character in the book who is at the same time both one of the more naive characters as well as one of the more insightful characters. And one of the things she says is, I think, without using the words, I think that the bombings in London are a false flag operation. I don't think that Eurasia is bombing London. I think that they're setting those off every once in a while to keep everybody in the mind frame that we're constantly at war. And as the 3rd act progresses, O'Brien pretty much says, there really is no war. And I think it comes out in the book as Winston is reading it as well. There's really very limited skirmishing that's taking place. They take over that one part of the world that is not absorbed into the 3, but by and large, there's very little conflict between the 3 powers.
Jaret mentioned a bit earlier that there are more people on Facebook than reside in any single country on the planet. What does this mean for corporate power? What does this mean for big tech and big media? Now, coming up on this program, we dig deeper into the book, and Jaret mentions something else that I found interesting, that the human mind is wired to find patterns even when there aren't any. All that's coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. And it's almost as if the 3 powers were all the same power, just in league with each other. It might as well be that case. Yep. And some people would say that that is the case with the modern world. That conflict, there's that movie Wag the Dog, where a whole war is
Kevin
manufactured.
Spacey.
I don't know. Is it Kevin Spacey? I know it's Robert De Niro and Dustin Hoffman.
Yes.
Maybe Kevin Spacey as well.
It's been too long.
Yeah, and it's a movie about how a war is manufactured to increase the political popularity of a current president, which I think is similar to Bill Clinton at the time. That's when it was written in the 90s. But it's not far-fetched. I mean, we know that American presidents go to war for political purposes. We know that George Bush timed the invasion of Iraq in 2003 with his re-election in 2004. Doesn't mean that that's the only reason Iraq was invaded, obviously.
No, and that's the thing. They set the stage. They do believe what they're doing is right. But you're right; they choose the timing on a politically expedient basis.
But I think there must be examples out there of warfare that either has been done or will in the future be waged purely for political purposes. And I think that that's a danger, because it means that when we read the newspaper or scroll through our Facebook feed and see that there's conflict out in the world, we don't know what's legitimate or not. We don't know what is actually a contest between powers or states or within states to achieve political ends, and what is simply to make me feel a certain way about conflict and sacrifice.
Well, and in a modern context in social media, there doesn't need to be a central narrative because everyone has their own bubbles. Everyone is seeing a certain portion of the feed. And so on the one hand, there are a few companies that are really powerful and have a huge user base. On the other hand, say Facebook has, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of communities, and within each of those communities there are self-reinforcing narratives. And you get into a community and you listen for a minute and it doesn't reinforce your narrative, you drop out and you go find one that does. So it's not creating a single narrative, it's creating a large number of narratives that are keeping people occupied.
What do you think about that? This is a theme on this podcast that keeps coming back to me. I guess it's just a theme for me, which is that in the modern cultural ecosystem, in the Western world that most people live in, watching Netflix, receiving their news by their phone, a mediated but also curated ecosystem where Netflix is not going to show me something that I won't like. It's not therefore going to show me something that might challenge me, make me think about the world in a truly different way, because it's only going to give me stuff that it knows I want, because it wants to continue feeding on this rolling down the hill of more stuff and more stuff and more stuff.
So you go into the grocery store and you're there to buy toothpaste. And for whatever reason, rather than just buying the toothpaste you always buy, you consider the whole wall. Have you seen the size of this section in the supermarket now and the number of false choices that you have? So, we're almost paralyzed by choices in that way. But what all of these algorithms and all of this AI online does now is when you walk in the store, they know without a shadow of a doubt that you want one of the following 2 tubes of toothpaste. So you don't have to consider the whole wall because they've already got it narrowed down so small that they can tell you which ones you'd want.
So why not make the rest of the wall invisible to you?
That's right. And so, the difference between traditional media and the new media, in the old media, everyone listened to Walter Cronkite and everyone trusted Walter Cronkite because there was, 3 networks and they all had their evening news. So there was this shared narrative. And so you could debate the points of that narrative, but you weren't arguing narrative against narrative. And now that's the case. Everyone has their own story, and if your story doesn't square with ours, then you're the other.
Right. And there are some who say, good. There are some, especially in Silicon Valley, the futurists who say, fine, good. Let everyone have their own universe. Let everyone have their own complete identity and universality within themselves. And that's actually moving forward because we're moving away from actually totalitarianism where the state is in charge of what you see and don't see, and the state is in charge of how you think. There are many who rejected the 3 networks of the United States because they thought, well, you're only, like Noam Chomsky is a perfect example of someone who said, you're only getting one narrow band of story here. And all of the other possibilities that are out here, you're not understanding and you're not seeing, and therefore most people aren't even aware that they exist. So the 3 networks would always base their programming on the notion that capitalism was here to stay. And Walter Cronkite wasn't going to suddenly get up one day and said, yeah, there's an interesting conversation out there about whether we should choose to move into a communist system. Tell me, what do you think about that? That was never going to happen.
Right.
And Noam Chomsky knew that. It's the same with the writing in the New York Times. Today we live in a world where those conversations are happening on the left and the right. And I wonder if Noam Chomsky in the 1980s might not have gone, yeah, maybe that's a good thing.
So we certainly need a diversity of thought. We need people to be able to explore all of these ideas, and we don't want a small group of people railroading us into certain conversations. But I think it feels now like some of the contention is we don't even have a shared truth. There are no shared truths. How can you trust the media if you have no shared truth? How can you trust the government if there isn't at least some baseline truth?
But some people are saying don't trust them.
Sure, but if we have no shared truth, we have no shared values. It's hyper individualism down to the individual. There's no reason to pay your taxes, Ben, because your taxes are going to somebody else who isn't you.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, but there are those who say that is good from an anarchist point of view.
Sure.
That aren't we moving towards a society in which, there are no taxes. There is no central government. We all just agree to get along
Right. I don't claim to speak on behalf of all anarchists, but I think the idea.
Why, are you one?
Yes, I wouldn't categorize myself as an anarchist, no. But I think that anarchists are concerned about totalitarianism. They're concerned about systems of control that are manufactured, and I think the systems of control where there are thousands of communities, each with their own narrative, nobody built that intentionally. It's an emergent phenomena. And so it comes out of a set of rules that were created. It's still control, but control of a different sort. So you still have people being balkanized off into all of these little communities. There's no one in charge.
Yeah, it's like control without a controller.
Right.
But does that mean it's control in search of a controller?
So yeah, no one's in charge. And I think that is one of the big concerns. That's sort of the underlying tension for a lot of people right now, is who is in charge. Is it Mark Zuckerberg? Is it Jeff Bezos? But they only built systems. They're riding the wave just as well, better than anyone else by certain measures, but they don't have big goals in mind. They're just building a system that has these outcomes. I think that's sort of the anxiety that a lot of people are feeling.
Mm-hmm. There's another aspect in this book that I wanted to dig into, which is death.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't recognize this the first time I read it. When I first read it, I saw all the political stuff. I saw the language stuff and the obsession with language and how language is evolving, which was always really interesting to me. Of course, I saw the personal story of someone being defeated by the state after they fall in love. And have a relationship that is in and of itself a rebellion against the state.
Because that's the immediate story.
Right. And I always found that fascinating, but I also found it fascinating, the commentary on the world we live in today. And I think at any time since Orwell wrote this book, we could say, yeah, this is not only prescient, but it's also indicative of what on earth is going on. But there was a part of the book that I didn't see until I read it again, which is death. And what I mean by that is that there's this constant reference to dying. And Orwell, obviously through Winston Smith, is afraid of death, but also feels that maybe death has already come. That Winston Smith, from the very first page of the book, is already dead. We are the dead.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was very depressed getting to the end of it. And I felt like this is not, I wouldn't even say horrifying. I didn't read it as a horror story. I read it as a very depressing tale of the end of humanity. And you
are the last man.
Right, and that's who Winston Smith is. You're the last man, and I'm going to put a bullet in the back of your head, and then you will be gone. So congratulations, you've figured it out, and then you're going to die.
Well, and the Eurasian system is a reference to death.
The death cult, the Eurasian,
they translate it two different ways.
East Asian is death worship.
Yes.
Yeah, I can't remember, but the
obliteration
says
of the self.
Obliteration of the self, and then it roughly translates to death worship.
Yeah, and O'Brien sort of puts it together very succinctly for Winston at one point and says, we are all dead for the fact that only the party survives. The party is immortal. The individual is not. You're just a cell. You're a cell in the body. Yeah. When you clip your fingernails, it doesn't mean anything because the body survives.
The death of the cell is the vigor of the organism.
That's right. Yeah, because we're just wasting energy on those fingernails anyway, so we don't need it. That's just something you're carrying along that you don't need.
So is there hope in that, though? I mean, I know this is really twisted because no one can read O'Brien and think, oh, that's hopeful. But he certainly feels that he has access to immortality. He certainly feels like my body can die and I can be unhealthy and then I can essentially let this go, but I know that I'm part of something greater. Is that not, if you flip the coin a little bit, don't you think that there's something positive to that I myself may die, but I was part of something greater than myself?
Yeah, and this is, I think, in comparing this to The Handmaid's Tale, which the series came on, I watched the first season, and I had to go back and read the book, which I'd read ages ago. It takes some of the depression away because the framing device of The Handmaid's Tale is, welcome to a conference where we're going to talk about that horrible period of history. And we're all academic scholars, and we're going to talk about how awful things were. So they got out. There is none of that. It is airtight. And when you read 1984, it's completely airtight.
Until you get to the appendix, though.
Yes. Yeah. So if you read you're absolutely right. But if you read just the body itself, when it says the end, those words fell really heavily on me because it is utterly without hope. And you keep waiting. You're watching as the reader for O'Brien to crack. You're watching for some loss in his resolve, for him to flinch. And I think because you're seeing through Winston's eyes, you're never going to see that. But you try to imagine O'Brien going home from a tough day of work torturing somebody, and he isn't 100% convinced. He is not entirely convinced that that this is the future and that the party is immortal and that it is perfect.
Reminds me of
but
the movie,
it doesn't tell you that in the book.
Have you seen the movie The Lives of Others?
No.
It's a German film, a really excellent film written and made in the early 2000s, I believe, but it was about the East German Stasi. Mm-hmm. So in the 1980s in East Germany, it was living in what was close to a totalitarian state. Mm-hmm. And it's about one of the Stasi, so the secret police members, who has to spy on a playwright who is working on an article about East German suicides, which of course is suppressed information that no one knows about. And he's trying to smuggle it out to the West so that this can be revealed, that people in East Germany are killing themselves at an unmanageable rate. And this Stasi member, who is like ice cold, he loves his work of oppressing and subjugating the East German people for the cause of, this great holy communism. And he changes in the course of the film. And it's one of those movies that always sticks with me because of how he changes and how impossible the change seems at the beginning and yet how inevitable it is at the end. That change doesn't... Sorry, go ahead.
Well, and in 1984, you see the opposite of that.
Yes.
That Winston Smith is broken, and that O'Brien never cracks, never shows. He only has more and more fervor as the book closes out.
Well, and I would also say that at the beginning of the book, it's also the opposite, because at the beginning of the book, change seems inevitable. Yep. You can't have this society forever.
This can't
hold. The clock is striking 13. That can't go on forever. And yet at the end of the book, it goes from inevitable at the beginning to impossible at the end. That Winston himself reverts back. He says earlier in the book that freedom is the ability to not only say 2 + 2 = 4, but freedom is also hating Big Brother. That is freedom. And he hopes that when the bullet goes from the back of his head and obliterates him forever, that he will continue to hate Big Brother.
Right, or that hate, he's hidden that hate, even from himself, but that it will well up. In the moments before him dying, he will hear the boots behind him, he will allow that hate, he will not have been conquered.
And the final sentence of the book is, nope,
I love him.
No, I love Big Brother, and it was as if the bullet goes in from the back into the front, and that inner thing that he was hiding from himself is obliterated, and that, to me, is death.
Yep.
That, to me, is death without having to die.
Just to come back to a point you made, as a Canadian living in the 21st century, I find it really interesting that one of the establishing devices that Orwell uses in this book is that metric is the system of the totalitarian.
Oh, yeah, right.
So there's the 24-hour clock, not necessarily metric, but very European. European. 24-hour clock, everything's measured in metric units, as opposed to pints and penny farthings and that sort of thing.
Which for a British person in the 1940s would have been anathema to their daily experience.
Yes, because if you can have, and I'm, I have a scientific background and I see things that aren't in powers of 10 as being absurd. But yeah, why just control language when you can control measurement? Measurement is a way in which we express ourselves. So yeah, they're all on metric as well.
One other thing in the book is that science is directly opposed to everything the party stands for, and therefore there will be no word for science in Newspeak.
Yeah, we're winding that department up. We can see it. It's within striking distance. That department will be closed down.
Do you think that's happening in our world, or do we still live in a fairly empirical universe?
I think if you look at sort of the end of the Cold War, and the analyses in retrospect really are that Russia just ran out of steam, that the Soviet Union couldn't self-sustain, couldn't manage 5-year plans, that it wasn't flexible enough, that it wasn't building the things that people actually needed, and there were constant shortages. And I think, in that respect, the capitalist system is superior, where there are market signals and people can very quickly figure out what people need. And so this is where the idea of the states that are in total balance doesn't seem to work for me. And the idea that they will all just go into stasis doesn't work. There will always be an advantage to the groups that do continue to fund research.
Right. It's the classic idea of, the growth of science and the Enlightenment in Europe in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, where you had all these different units that were able to compete with one another. So if all of them agreed that, no, we're not going to pursue these crazy ideas of Galileo and Copernicus, we're just going to let them lie.
Yeah.
But all it takes is one country.
Yeah.
One country like the Netherlands to say, actually, let's check this out.
That's right.
Maybe this will lead us somewhere. And then by the time it has an advantage, all the other ones have to say, okay, we'll go with that. And that a lot of historians have contrasted that with China in the same period, which was a homogenous country that couldn't compete with itself. If the state said one thing, that was the way it was going to be. And a lot of people say, Jared Diamond in his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, doesn't say that this is why, but he suggests that maybe the reason Europeans had an advantage over China, we know why they had it over the rest of the world, guns, germs, and steel. That doesn't apply to China.
Right.
And he said that maybe one of the reasons is that there was this ability to compete, that there was this fervor of knowledge and discovery that happened in Europe because of competition. So when I read that geopolitical situation of the three powers, I always think, again, maybe this is too much of a fantasy because one of them is going to find a way.
And it's a really good example, again, of doublethink, where on the one hand, the government, O'Brien is arguing, we're going to shut down science and research and all of that. On the other hand, they're claiming all past victories. So it was the party that invented the helicopter. It was the party that invented flight, right? All of these things are things we made. But I don't think they're going to keep going back and say, well, we invented the printing press, because eventually they don't want for there to be books, right?
Sure.
So it isn't just stasis.
And there had to be something to revolt against, too.
That's right.
So this idea of doublethink, is this still applicable to today? Is it still something to fear? Or is this kind of this interesting, fantastic notion that doesn't really place too much danger for us today?
No, I think doublethink is something that people still do, that all of us.
So what is it, first of all?
So the idea of holding two contradictory thoughts or ideas at the same time and believing both to be true. And I think we all do this to some degree. It's not a black-white. It's not where we imagine something. On the one hand, we use it as an insult against someone else to say they're the sort of person who can't see that black is different than white. And on the other hand, and then when you're complimenting someone, you say, for the person who believes in the cause, they're willing to believe that black is white if that's what the party says.
And that can be a virtue.
That's right. It's a virtue in this system. But we all hold contradictory thoughts. And this is where you see, particularly in politics, people say people are voting against their best interest, right? Is that we don't hold things dispassionately. The market is not entirely rational. And so we all hold contradictory thoughts, but doublethink is a very powerful form of that, where you hold two completely contradictory thoughts immediately adjacent to one another and you just accept it.
Right. It would almost be like believing that the earth is flat, but having to accept for those times that you board an airplane that it's round.
Yes.
Or at least that I'm going to assume it's round for this particular day on this particular pursuit, but I know actually that it's flat.
That's right. And the human mind is built to find patterns. And so this is where, you talked earlier about having all of the ideas on the table, everything open for discussion. But because we're wired to see patterns, even where there aren't, this is where people can convince themselves that the earth is flat. And they can sit down and they can do the math O'Brien talks about in the book to say, you think we can't use math to show that the earth is flat or that the earth is at the center of the universe, 5? Or 2 plus 2 is 5? So we do hold those contradictory thoughts.
Yeah, there's a line in the book that talks about how that made me think, if I were to argue my objective reality, 2 plus 2 equals 4, with someone like the greatest expert in mathematics of all time, they would beat me in the debate. They would trounce me in a debate and convince me that 2 plus 2 equals 5, even though I know that it's 4.
And that's one of the things that Orwell really didn't go into any depth in the book, is on education. So on the one hand, they talk about the spy agencies and that sort of thing.
And kids being spies on their parents.
Kids being spies, but they don't really talk about how they construct the education system in such a way that they can best leverage this desire for control. They don't say, well, kids used to go to school until they were 18, but now they only go until they're 12. There's no real thorough discussion of the education system in the book.
That's a really good point, yeah.
So there's a missing piece there.
And you have to wonder what that would look like, because there has to be some kind of collective education system. I mean,
Right.
it's a world of indoctrination, and it also has to prepare people for work.
Well, and O'Brien is clearly a well-educated man. And so is it the case that only members of the inner party go on to some sort of post-secondary? Because this is part of what breaks Winston, is that O'Brien always knows more than he does. So is there a system where, the proles only go to school until grade 5 or 6, say, and then the outer party, they're going to need junior high because they're going to need some skills to be able to do their jobs, and then only members of the inner party get the full education?
I think there's also a sense that Winston is educated because he lived before the party had the control that it does now in 1984.
Yes.
That, that there were the famous, it's referenced many times, the purges of the 50s and 60s that he lived through. He was born in a world that was not a totalitarian Oceania.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean he was educated in that world. It's just that he lived through this transition. That anyone born in 1984 is completely screwed.
Yeah, and they talk in the book about the sort of, I would say, the chemical. We're gonna kill your brain with gin. We're gonna do all that sort of stuff. But one of the things that Brave New World, which was released almost 20 years before, talks a lot more about the biochemical, and it sort of anticipated a lot of bioengineering, and they don't really talk about that in the book. And so some of the less believable parts of 1984 are when they get in, they say, we've eliminated the love that children feel for their parents. But they don't provide any evidence that it's just pure indoctrination. And the idea that you could kill the biological urge without some form of biomanipulation, bioengineering, that doesn't ring true today. And that might just be our modern understanding.
Yeah, there's that image in 1984 that O'Brien gives to Winston. He says, if you want to imagine the future, think of a boot stamping on the human face forever.
Yeah.
And
so there's the nature-nurture debate. And so it seems like the book argues that nurture is everything here, because we can stamp all of those things out of people. We can stamp the love of the parent out of the child. We can stamp the love of one individual for another. We can do all of those things, and we don't really have to address the nature side of it.
Right. Whereas in Brave New World, it's almost accepting that these things exist, but we're gonna distract you. We're gonna make you feel good. We're gonna give you soma.
That's right.
To just make you feel everything is fine.
And if you're an epsilon, we're going to handicap you before you're born. Right. We're going to feed you a cocktail of drugs that will mean that you're a semi-moron. So I think Brave New World was more interesting in that respect, more complete in its picture in that respect of keeping people biologically differentiated.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas in 1984, there's this sense of, again, death. That this really grim world. It almost reminds me of the Cormac McCarthy book, The Road, and the movie with Viggo Mortensen, which there is no hope. I mean, this is.
And I need to take, after reading this one, I need to take about 6 months off, and then I'll come back to The Road, which is what I've been meaning to get to. But yeah, it was.
Have you read it before?
I've not.
Yeah, it's there is no hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This book was like deeply depressing. I've only finished it this week. But I also really enjoy it. And I think part of that is they say, art sometimes reflects the other in the way that when times are really good, you can write dystopian novels, post-World War II. When times are good, you can put out really scary movies or horrific movies. When times are bad, people need a little bit of consolation. They need the escape. And so my life's been really good. And so I think I'm able to read a dystopian novel and put it down and walk away from it because I live a really good life.
Yeah, let me say that. I enjoy this book immensely. I know, I hope this conversation hasn't been depressing. It hasn't. It's been invigorating for me.
Yeah.
But I recognize that this can be a depressing book, but it's also incredibly enlightening. It answers the question for me, what on earth is going on? And anything that tries to answer that question to me is entertaining. I get a front row seat to history, even if history is kind of grim and crappy for people living in it.
Yeah, and it was written in 1949 as science fiction because a lot of the ideas were a long ways off. Whereas Brave New World, some of the things written in there still haven't been realized. We're still not bioengineering people and that sort of thing. So it reads... 1984 reads now not as sci-fi. It reads now as in sort of alternate past.
Jaret, is there one thing in this conversation, final question, that you wish we had gotten into, that you wish we dug into, that if we had another hour to talk, that we could chat about?
Honestly, there are so many. What I want to do next is just go on and read the whole rest of the dystopian set. I know I just said that I can't take it right now, but I'll take about a week off and I'll get back to these. I've always loved dystopian sci-fi, particularly those that are in the immediate future, because you can sort of see our world and reflect on what it is that you don't want the world to be.
For me, I'm interested in actually digging more into Orwell's work and his other writings, his nonfiction writings about the state of the world and the state of language. I mean, he was a newspaper writer. He worked for the BBC. This is a guy who really tried to understand the way that we communicate with each other, and that is a main question today of what on earth is going on.
I would say George Orwell is one of my favorite authors. Another one of my favorite authors is Tolkien. And so the interesting connection between those two, I mean, Tolkien, they say, wrote The Lord of the Rings was the small work that he wrote in a much larger world, and he did all of it to create a language. He was a professor of language, and so he did all of that just to fully imagine the world in which a language would live. He built the world for the language, and I think much the same could be said of 1984, that this Newspeak language needed a world to live in.
Well, and interestingly, Tolkien wrote that during a very dark time as an escape, just like you were just saying.
That's right. He was in the trenches.
Yeah. Jaret, this has been a really cool conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it.
To learn more about 1984 by George Orwell, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes, as well as a way to get in touch with me by email or on social media to give me your suggestions for future guests or future topics to be discussed on this program. Your quote of the week is from 1984 by George Orwell, and it goes like this: "The best books are those that tell you what you know already." Thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein, and special thanks for this episode to Jaret Hargreaves for giving us his apartment in Calgary to stop by and do this episode. Next week, we're talking with Yana Dubinsky in Ottawa about marketing, culture, travel, and more. I'll see you then.